The young and the restless Nick was unraveling. In the days leading up to the trial, he had become a ghost of the man Genoa City once knew, the loyal son, the trusted brother, the honorable protector of the Newman legacy. But all that had collapsed into ash. He had been accused, demonized, painted as a murderer not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented, a convenient scapegoat, a name that stirred enough envy and notoriety to distract from the truth. Damien's blood may have stained the marble floors of a villa in Nice, but it was Nick's life that was being sacrificed on the altar of fabricated justice. And now, seated in the courtroom, the weight of a city's betrayal had hollowed out the last flicker of fight he had left. He sat slumped at the defense table, unshaven, eyes sunken, jaw clenched in silent fury. His suit no longer fit right, too loose, too worn, and his hands trembled beneath the surface like a storm trapped beneath skin. The cameras were rolling, the reporters whispering behind glossy tablet screens, and the people he once called friends stared at him like a caged beast, hungry for guilt. Michael sat beside him, hands folded, voice calm, but his arguments, no matter how elegant, meant nothing in the face of the evidence meticulously laid out by the prosecution. And that evidence was airtight. The murder weapon had been discovered in Nick's bathroom, wiped but bearing the faint outline of his fingerprints. His footprints matched those in the hallway outside Damien's suite. The CCTV footage? Gone. Erased. Deleted by someone with a perfect sense of timing. And the bourbon glass? Laced with a sedative that matched traces found in Nick's bloodstream. The killer had planned every detail with the precision of a surgeon, clean, exact, untraceable, and now Nick was bleeding for it. The judge read through the list of charges with the same detached cadence one might use to describe weather. Nicholas Newman, you are hereby charged with the murder of Damien Moreau. Evidence submitted includes, and the words faded into white noise as Nick stared straight ahead, rage mounting behind his eyes like a dam on the verge of rupture. He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab the microphone, throw the table, force someone to see the madness of it all. But every time he tried to speak, his voice cracked, warped by disbelief and exhaustion. And when he finally rose, shouting, pleading, swearing on everything he had ever loved, the bailiffs were on him in seconds. He fought them off at first, pushing back, veins flaring in his neck, shouting that he didn't kill Damien, that this was a setup, that someone had framed him with surgical perfection. But his voice was swallowed by the walls, by the polished wood, by the silence of those who should have defended him. Michael barely raised his hand. The judge didn't flinch. And from the gallery, Victor stood frozen, hands gripping the edge of the pew until his knuckles turned bone white. Victoria's mascara ran down her cheeks. Nikki wept silently, her sobs muffled by the handkerchief she gripped so tightly her rings cut into her palm. It wasn't just grief. It was helplessness. Because they knew, deep down, that the system didn't care about who Nick was, only about what it could prove. And the killer had done his job well. No loopholes. No inconsistencies. No mercy. The verdict hadn't even been reached, and yet the room already felt like a tomb. Nick was dragged back into his seat, wrists bruised, tie askew, his voice hoarse from screaming. His eyes darted across the courtroom, searching for anyone who might still believe in him. But there was no one. Not anymore. The public had made up their minds. The judge had seen enough. And Michael, even he, had the look of a man drowning in defeat. What Nick didn't know was that somewhere in the back offices of the courthouse, a technician had just returned from a routine archive run. He had found a corrupted file that had been marked for deletion, a blurry segment of hallway footage timestamped exactly 15 minutes before the murder. It showed a figure entering Damien's suite. Tall. Hooded. Limping slightly on the left leg. Not Nick. Not even close. But the technician, unaware of its importance, had shelved it for review, planning to get to it after lunch. By the time the court reconvened, the footage would either be lost forever, or become the key to unlocking the truth. Back in the gallery, Lily sat with a storm raging in her chest. She wanted to rise, to scream that Damien was alive, that Nick was innocent, that the real killer was still watching from the shadows. But she couldn't. The threats she had received were no longer vague. A photo had been delivered to her hotel room that morning, a shot of her daughter walking into school, circled in red ink. The message was clear: speak and blood will follow. So she sat. And she watched. And she broke. And somewhere, in a surveillance room above the courtroom, Chance watched too, calm, still, unreadable. He said nothing. Did nothing. But for a split second, his hand brushed the receiver in his pocket, checking the signal. A message had been sent an hour earlier. 3 words: the fall begins. If Nick went to prison, the chaos that followed would bury the truth forever. And perhaps that was the plan all along. Unless, of course, the footage made it out in time. As the gavel struck wood and the room fell into hushed finality, no one noticed the man with the hooded coat seated quietly near the back row of the courtroom gallery. His presence was too casual to be threatening, too still to draw suspicion, but for those few who turned to glance at him. Security, a reporter, a retired clerk, something about him stirred an ancient instinct to flee. He never removed his hood, not even as the fluorescent lights beamed down on the courtroom, not even when the room grew warm with breath and judgment. He sat, observing, absorbing, smiling, that slow, crooked sneer that curled at the edge of his lips like poison waiting to spill. No one knew his name, but one thing was certain. The killer had entered the house of justice not with fear, but with arrogance. His eyes, partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood, flicked toward Nick as the verdict was read. Guilty. Of course. Nick had played the role so perfectly: emotional, irrational, explosive, the perfect mask of guilt. And now he was being escorted from the courtroom, defeated, restrained, humiliated. The killer tilted his head slightly, admiring the spectacle like an artist surveying his completed work. But then, a ripple of unease passed through the room. For just a moment, the killer's grin froze, as though a whisper had touched his ear. Was it paranoia? Or had he noticed the faint glimmer in Michael's eye, the slight lift in the corners of the attorney's mouth? Michael had been unusually quiet today. His objections muted, his tone resigned, his behavior submissive, too submissive. And Chance, though standing outside the bounds of official jurisdiction in France, had been present the entire time, silent, tense, lingering at the edge of the proceedings like a shadow too stubborn to disappear. They weren't celebrating. They weren't broken. They were waiting. The theory emerged almost as quickly as the handcuffs snapped closed on Nick's wrists, that this trial was a performance. A bait. A trap. That Nick, wrongfully accused, had agreed to sacrifice his freedom temporarily so that the real killer would grow bold, complacent, perhaps even careless enough to make a move. That Michael, ever the tactician, had designed a public defeat in order to orchestrate a private victory. But theories were dangerous in a place like Nice, where legal lines blurred, where jurisdiction was tangled in diplomatic red tape, and where men like Chance had no real power. He was a foreigner here, a spectator with no authority. His badge meant nothing in this courtroom, and any unofficial operation could risk catastrophic consequences, not just for the investigation, but for Nick's life. And yet, Genoa was burning, and now Nice had become the second theater of war. The chaos in both cities had been carefully curated. Someone had turned 2 continents into chessboards and was now playing both sides, moving pawns, sacrificing bishops, staging elaborate distractions while the truth remained buried in silence. Michael knew this. So did Chance. But could they act fast enough? Could they strike before the killer vanished again into the night? Back inside the courtroom, the hooded man rose from his seat. His grin had returned, but it was sharper now, tinged with malice. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and exited through the rear hallway just as Nick was led out through the opposite door. He moved through the corridors with ease, unseen, unnoticed. Almost as if he belonged. Almost as if he had been here before. Almost as if he had been involved in orchestrating every movement of this trial. Outside, Lily waited by the fountain, pacing with trembling hands and a letter tucked deep inside her coat, a letter she hadn't yet decided to reveal. It was from Damien. Dated just 3 days earlier. He had named a man. A man with a scar beneath his jaw. A man who had once worked under the codename Baron. A man now believed to be using a fake identity tied to the French consulate. A man who, it was said, wore a hood wherever he went. She looked up just as the man passed by the marble gate. He glanced at her. Just once. And the air turned cold in her lungs. If this was the killer, and her gut told her it was, then they were all in danger. And if the trial had truly been a setup, then the time to strike was now. But how? Michael couldn't act without jurisdiction. Chance couldn't arrest him on French soil. Nick was already in a holding cell beneath the courthouse. And Lily? She was just one woman, with a secret and a heartbeat growing louder by the second. And yet, amid the spiraling chaos, a single hope remained, the missing footage. Somewhere in the depths of the court's digital archives, the corrupted file had been restored. Pixelated but usable. It showed the killer exiting Damien's suite with blood on his hand and a blade tucked into his jacket. He limped. He coughed. And for one fateful second, he looked directly at the camera, hood tilted back just enough for the light to catch the scar beneath his jaw. That footage was now en route to Michael's encrypted inbox. Sent by Vesper, the same anonymous source who had warned Lily days ago. The final piece of the puzzle was moving toward the board. And if it arrived in time, if Michael and Chance could act before the killer vanished again, then Nick might have a chance at freedom. But if not, then the courtroom would soon host more than one tragedy. Because the killer had no intention of running this time. He wanted blood. And Lily, brave, stubborn Lily, had just become his next target. Outside the courthouse, the bells rang across the city. But there was no celebration. Only tension, trembling beneath the stone streets of Nice. A campaign of deception had begun, and no one knew where it would end.